We reviewed the AMD R5 3600 extremely positively just before this review went live. This is for the R9 3900X. The 3600 was a strong start to AMD's third generation of Ryzen processors, or second generation of Zen architecture, and set the stage for continued dominance in the $200 price range of desktop CPUs. With that framing in mind, it's time to look at the R9 3900X, a $500 12-core, 24-thread CPU that competes most directly with Intel's i9-9900K, priced roughly around $45 to $500 for a frequency-focused platform. This review will look first at production workloads like Premiere, Blender, Photoshop, Vray, 7-Zip, and more, and then turn to gaming, power consumption, and additional benchmarks. Before that, this video is brought to you by Gigabyte's X570 Aorus Master motherboard, built with a true 14-phase VRM and for high-end Ryzen 3000 series builds. The Gigabyte X570 Master uses a properly finned heatsink for VRM cooling, accompanied by RGB LEDs in the I/O cover to mix looks and performance. Gigabyte also includes BIOS flash features to update the motherboard BIOS without a CPU or RAM. The overbuilt VRM is the major feature on this board though, and Gigabyte has a brand new BIOS for overclocking the new Ryzen 3000 series CPUs. Learn more at the link in the description below. So like the R5 3600 review, we're going to get straight into this today because there's too much data, it's too dense, we can't really delay on stuff. We might have some additional information for you in the opening of the 3600 review, so even if you don't care about that processor, which you should watch the first couple of minutes of it after the ad break and see if you can get answers to any additional methodology questions. The basics though, 3200 megahertz for everything. That's done because it works on all the platforms we're testing today, including the first generation of Ryzen, so we get a fair comparison across all the platforms. And also it's pretty common to buy, and we'll do memory scaling later. Secondly, Windows 1903 is used for everything here. We're using the latest BIOS updates for Intel platforms, and we're using FC5 for the Gigabyte Master motherboard, the X570 Master for testing here. And then additionally, timings have been heavily controlled. That's all been stated in the other video. So with that said, the 3900X is the target today. It's a $500 CPU. We're reviewing that, particularly as compared to the 9900K, which is another roughly $500 CPU. And I think with that, we can get into it. So overclocking will be included, power consumption, and just about everything else that you could want, for the most part. We have thermals coming later as well. AMD's R9 3900X is highly competitive in Vray, which is a chaos group renderer that has grown in popularity among 3D artists. Vray is measured in time until render completed, so lower is better as it means the work will be proofed or finalized faster. The 3900X completes our Vray Benchmark render in 0.75 minutes when stock, and 0.72 minutes when all-core overclocks to 4.3 GHz, a time reduction of about 4%. Like the R5 3600 we reviewed, the R9 3900X is already pushed so hard with stock all-core boost that this isn't a huge overclock, but we couldn't get it to 4.4 GHz with SMT enabled. The 9900K stock CPU, following TDP spec, completes the render in 1.1 minutes, marking the stock 3900X as requiring 33% less time to render. The 9900K at 5.2 GHz manages in 0.95 minutes, behind the overclocked 3900X by about 14 seconds. The 2700X at 4.2 GHz finished this render slower than the stock 9900K at 1.17 minutes, so this is a big leap from core count for AMD and generationally. Adobe Photoshop is a very different story for AMD. This chart has a clear divide under the 9600K at 5.1 GHz, where Intel rules uncontested above that. This serves to remind us all that not every application is 100% thread-bound and can utilize all of those threads. Photoshop likes frequency, and that's something we always demonstrate by highlighting the 9700K and the 9900K, both at 5.1 GHz, where there's a 2x thread differential, but nearly identical scores. That's because it's frequency bound. The R3000 series has picked up considerably compared to previous AMD generations with thanks to IPC and frequency uplift, but this frequency dependence is still shown on the 3900X. The 3900X stock CPU scored 1,053 points, allowing the stock 9900K a lead of 2%. This is impressive generationally for AMD, where the 9900K stock led the 2700X stock CPU by 24%. In this case, the overclocked 3900X is within margin of error. In this test, there are some workloads that only run a few threads, which means that a stock 3900X with a higher boosting stock turbo table will do better than an all-core OC, which is lower than some of the individual core clocks when running with limited thread workloads. So all-core is higher than stock all-core, but it's not higher than the stock limited thread workload boost. Overclocking the 9900K propels it ahead of its stock results by 7% and ahead of the stock 3900X by 9%. Our next benchmark is a cache test. Our GNU compiler collection benchmark compiles GCC with GCC in a SIGWIN environment, but we've also validated on MinGW with MSys2 and see similar results. When we asked Wendell of Level 1 Techs about this, he described it as, quote, cache hits all the way down. Note that we are not benchmarking compilers against each other or code quality when compiled, but compile time only. Other compile solutions may favor Intel more heavily, but presently this is what we use to test. We may add more compilers if we get good suggestions from the programmers in our audience. With the R9 3900X stock CPU, the 64MB L3 cache pulls its weight, with Ryzen's victim cache particularly useful compared to Intel in this test. As we noted in the 3600 review, the R5 3600 stock CPU can outperform the 2700X OC 4.2 GHz CPU here because it has more cache at 32 versus 16 megabytes for L3. The R9 3900X pushes to a 7.1 minute compile time, reduced from the R5 3600 7.9 minute result by 10% in time required. The all-core OC doesn't matter here. 7-zip testing is next. For this one, we're using 7-zip compression to benchmark millions of instructions per second per device. The R9 3900X stock CPU reaches 103,435 MIPS during compression workloads, and that positions it far and away above the next processor, which is the 9900K stock's 66,000 MIPS, a lead of 57% for AMD. This is a workload that is heavily thread dependent, and that shows here. Overclocking to 4.3 GHz all-core doesn't do much, but it does provide enough uplift to get us 1.2% over the stock result for the 3900X. The i9 9900K at 5.2 GHz jumps to 70,553 MIPS, but it's not enough to come close to AMD's compression score at a similar price. 7-zip decompression is next. In this testing, Intel does comparatively significantly better than in compression versus itself, but not versus the 3900X. The 3900X still holds a strong lead. It's 142,000 MIPS versus 94,000 MIPS for an overclocked 9900K, roughly, which puts AMD at about a 52% lead in this workload when the 3900X is stock and the 9900K is at one of its best points. Stock to stock, the 3900X leads the 9900K's 85,000 MIPS results by 68%. Compared to AMD's own R7 2700X of last generation, the lead is similar, as the 2700X roughly tied the 9900K stock CPU previously. Blender is up next. We like this one because it's software that we actually use. For instance, we designed our GN 3D teardown crystal with Blender to build a model in 3D space and get it laser etched into glass. So this is something that we have a lot of experience with. Blender is also popular for animation and is the biggest open source solution to 3D modeling and animation. With Blender 2.79, the GN Monkey Head stress test creates a mixed workload on CPUs that's heavily thread dependent. In this test, the R9 3900X stock CPU completes the render in 12.8 minutes, a reduction in time required from the 9900K stock CPU's 20-minute results by 40%. That's a big climb for the dollar amount and is thanks in large part to the thread increase. Compared to AMD's own R7 2700X CPU, we see a 10-minute render time reduction stock to stock, and overclocking isn't too different. Note that overclocking a 2700 to the same frequency, 4.2 GHz, would net the same results as the 2700X at 4.2 GHz because they are the same aside from frequency. We'll point out that CUDA rendering is often faster than CPU rendering for Blender, but there are instances when we use CPU rendering internally instead. For the most part, these instances are when we exceed CUDA memory with a large object or project file, as we can run more system memory than we can VRAM, or when we need to render a lot of smaller tiles in a flat image with a lot of threads, which can go faster than the larger blocks of CUDA. Our GN ModMat is what taught us this part. Despite being a flat image, we made it in Blender. And for this, we find CPU rendering to be faster than GPU rendering, as we can crush the tile size down to be more efficient to fit the higher thread count CPUs, where one tile spawns per thread. So that's a potential use case if you didn't know about it. Anyway, overclocking the 9900K gets it to 16.7 minutes, which is a huge uplift from stock, down 18% in render time, but still not enough. With the GN logo render, a more intensive ray traced scene, the stock R9 3900X finishes in 15.6 minutes, with an overclock finishing 5% faster at 14.8 minutes, or 5% less time. The Intel 9900K stock CPU takes 26 minutes for this render, with the 2700X stock CPU at 28 minutes, and 2700X 4.2 GHz all-core CPU, the same as a 2700 at the same frequency, finishing in 26.6 minutes. This meant that previously Intel was technically in the lead for Blender, despite an obvious price advantage for near equivalence with a 2700X OC. Now though, AMD not only leapfrogs Intel at the price point, but also completes the render significantly faster. Now, this changes as you go up into HEDT parts, but the price gets blown out of our comparison for today. For those using CPU renderers at home, the 3900X is an easy choice in this sub-HEDT class for cycles rendering. Adobe Premiere CC 2019 renders are next. For this one, we're rendering one of our 1080p videos from a show floor, basically an RNG or an ENG environment, using all A-roll and B-roll. Our other test is a 4K 60 encode comprised of A-roll and B-roll in the studio, with some lumetry and audio correction applied. For the 1080p render, the AMD R9 3900X surprised us, where the R5 3600 and AMD's previous R7 2700X couldn't beat Intel. The R9 3900X is now finally managing to pull ahead, which is a milestone for AMD. Premiere first favors frequency and IPC, but it does make use of additional threads somewhat efficiently, just not typically enough where it helps AMD. This is why the 3175X is better than a 9980XE, is better than a 9900K at rendering Premiere. Despite the obscene thread count on the 3175X and lower frequencies, it does actually begin to make a difference with that many threads. Anyway, the 3900X finishes the render in 3.4 minutes when stock and 3.3 minutes when overclocked, with the 9900K completed in 3.8 minutes. That's a time reduction of 11%, which, considering the thread count is 50% higher, is a nonlinear increase that highlights the importance of frequency in this test. Overclocking the 9900K to 5.1 GHz gets it to 3.6 minutes, but that's the most we get out of the chip. Note that, as always, we're using CUDA acceleration for these, so these are realistic times for someone actually doing a render for YouTube upload. We are not artificially limiting it to just the CPU, because for YouTube uploads, CUDA acceleration is a good thing. The acceleration applies evenly, leaving the CPU on its own to make up ground where it can, and that's where we start to see the 3900X pull ahead where we actually didn't expect it to originally. The 4K 60 render is more intensive. For this one, the R9 3900X completes the render in 9 minutes, with the 4.3 GHz all-core OC finishing in 8.8 minutes. The 9900K at stock settings and TDP finishes in 11.9 minutes, or 10.7 when overclocked to 5.1 GHz. The end result is an 18% time reduction for the overclocked 3900X versus the overclocked 9900K. And for generational perspective, although core counts are not equal, the 3900X outperforms the 2700X at 4.2 GHz, ranked at 12.8 minutes, by 30%, and the 1700 at 3.9 GHz at 4.2 minutes by 37% time reduction. This is mostly from more threads, and that's obviously important here, but to be fair, the price is also a bit higher. So the 3700X will be an interesting comparison for this one, which will be in a separate review for us. Before getting started, we need to take a look at how frequency boosting behavior is on the 3900X. We did this for the 3600 as well, and it helps to illustrate all-core turbos under good thermal conditions. In a Blender all-core workload, the frequency averages about 4087 MHz across all cores. If you're wondering why the frequency isn't hitting the advertised boost of 4.6 GHz, that's because the listed boost frequencies only apply for limited thread load scenarios, which Blender is not. We'll next intentionally zoom in on the chart, shifting the y-axis around to 4000 MHz and stopping at 4200 MHz. We're also going to just dump all the lines on the chart at once, even though it's not particularly legible. As you can see here, the cores boost up and down, bouncing between the 4050 MHz and 4100 MHz range in alternating patterns between each core. The only time frequency ever exceeds 4100 MHz is in the pre-test idle period. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the last one we'll show. Same thing, we're just dumping them all on the chart at the same time. As shown here, 4600 MHz is sparingly reached under single core workloads, which are uncommon in these applications except between loading, for example. For the rest of the gaming scenario, we're around 4200 to 4225 MHz, sometimes up to 4275 MHz or 4300 MHz. It all just depends on how many cores are actively loaded. Total War Warhammer 2 testing is up first. We use the battle and the campaign benchmarks for this. The campaign map benchmark is our preferred Total War Warhammer 2 CPU test with a greater reliance on CPU power than the battle benchmark and less GPU intensive effects. As predicted, the distance to the 9900K is wider than with the battle results. Stock versus stock, the Intel 9900K at 179 FPS average is 28% ahead of the 3900X's 140 FPS average. These two CPUs are mostly tied in 1% and 0.1% low values, and there is no perceptible difference to frame time fluidity to the user for frame times, but the 9900K does have a meaningful improvement in average frame rate overall. Overclocking the 3900X yielded some of the best results here that we've seen on a 3000 series part so far, placing it 4% ahead. So all-core overclocking, clearly not necessarily the most worthwhile endeavor on the 3900X. The 9900K's 5.1 GHz OC is an even greater 30.9% ahead in average FPS versus the 3900X at 4.3 GHz all-core, so OC versus OC. This is a worst-case scenario for the 3900X competitively. It's a game that doesn't benefit from high thread counts that much, as illustrated by the stock 9600K and multiple generations of old CPUs like the 7700K ranking pretty high on the charts, and it strongly corresponds to increases in frequency and performs worse with SMT enabled. Disabling SMT and overclocking to 4.4 GHz pops the 3900X average up to 171 FPS from 140, with some respectable improvement in the 1% 0.1% lows as well, pushing it past any of the 3600's results. With SMT on, the 3600 actually outperformed the 3900X both stock and OC, partly due to thread utilization and scheduling in this title, and because of how the all-core frequencies behave with boosting differences between the 3600 and the 3900X. The story is mostly the same at 1440p, but with results at the upper end limited by the GPU as they were in the battle benchmarks. Note that the overclock to 9900K drops from 190 FPS average at 1080p down to 174 FPS average at 1440p, while the 3900X's results are hardly affected. This indicates that we are bottlenecking on the GPU for the 9900K, but that the 3900X is limiting the GPU in its test. The battle benchmark is up next at 1080p. The 9900K at 171 FPS average is about 7.5% ahead of the 3900X's 159 FPS average, stock versus stock. But as we mentioned before, the battle benchmark becomes GPU limited towards the upper end of the chart, even at 1080p. The lack of major improvement between the stock and 5.1 GHz overclock of the 9900K indicates that FPS averages will max out at about 175 FPS with these settings and with the GPU we're using, and we may see a wider gap in other games without this limitation. This is further proven by looking at the 9600K and 9700K OC positions, which illustrate a GPU bottleneck. Overclocking did a little better for the 3900X, ranking at 165 FPS average, but it's still only a 3.3% uplift at 4.3 GHz all-core, as AMD's per-core boosting in games keeps up with the best all-core clocks that we can push. The R5 3600 at 159 FPS average is performing functionally equally to the 3900X in this benchmark and is nearing error for 0.1% lows, although not quite. As with the 3600, disabling SMT to limit the 3900X to 12 cores and 12 threads had a more positive impact on performance than the 24-thread all-core overclock. This time, we also overclocked it to 4.4 GHz with SMT off, allowing the 3900X to stretch to 167 FPS average. To be very clear here, we wouldn't recommend disabling SMT on any of these processors, as it's hit and miss in games and obviously cuts production workloads in half. This is more of an exercise to learn about the performance. F1 2018 is next. This is a DirectX 11 game and gives us a look at the Ego engine. The stated competitor for the 3900X is the 9900K, but F1 at 1080p is another test where the 9900K is far ahead, about 13.5% stock versus stock, with a 313 FPS average to the 3900X's 276 FPS average. The modest 3.6% improvement in the 3900X's score from a 4.3 GHz overclock does close the gap somewhat, jumping to 286 FPS average, as the 5.1 GHz OC on the 9900K had barely any effect and was bouncing off of GPU limits. This is another title where SMT overhead hurts the 3900X's performance, although not so much that it drops to 3600 levels this time. Disabling SMT and overclocking to 4.4 GHz landed at 302 FPS average, closing much of the gap, although we'd again advise against disabling SMT in actual use. The narrower range of results at 1440p means that the 3900X is effectively equal in performance to the cheaper R5 3600, whether that's stock with an overclock. That's not likely due to a GPU hardware limitation elsewhere in this test either. Moving on to Civilization 6. This game uses a turn time benchmark rather than an FPS benchmark for our charts. This is useful for indicating how long it takes each of the 5 AI players to process its turn before passing to the next player. If the average turn time, for example, is 30 seconds, it would take 150 seconds after clicking End Turn to return to the player's next move. Civilization 6 suffers from the same problems with SMT overhead that some of the other titles do, based on the 3600 6-core 6-thread results, and the 6-core 12-thread results for that same processor, but it's also the only game benchmark that we score by average turn time instead of FPS, meaning no GPU bottlenecking for even the high-end CPUs. Lower is better, and every fraction of a second is significant because of the low variance between the runs. An all-core overclock of 4.3 GHz only reduced turn time by 3.7%, which is a fair indication of what's happening in the Civ benchmark. The advertised boost clock for the 3900X is 4.6 GHz, so in benchmarks that allow the CPU to reach its single-core boost clock, the OC results may actually be worse than stock. Disabling SMT and pushing the OC to 4.4 GHz cut the average time further, but even with this best-case scenario, the 30.4 second average turn time for the 3900X allows the 9900K to remain 2.3% shorter in turn times. Overclocking the 9900K gets it down to 28.2 seconds, which is a 7% reduction versus the best-case 3900X. Assassin's Creed Origins is our next test. As we highlighted in the R5 3600 review, this game actually likes both cores and frequency with some level of balance, making it one of the best balanced gaming benchmarks we use for CPU reviews. Of all the games we tested, Assassin's Creed gives the 3900X the best shot at leveraging its 24 threads. As with the 3600, turning SMT off worsened performance even with the moderate clock speed increases, as it ideally should, so we can ignore these numbers for once. The 3900X stock CPU performed at 134 FPS average with lows well paced at 93 FPS 1% and 84 FPS 0.1%, and disabling SMT while overclocking brought down the FPS to 124, a reduction of 8% with settings that were best case scenarios in other games, but obviously not all of them. The stock 9900K runs at 140 FPS average here and is beginning to bounce off of 2080 Ti limits, pushing just 4.3% ahead of the stock 3900X as a result. This is a GPU limitation. In other benchmarks with less of a GPU bottleneck, we've seen ranges between 13 and 30% advantage for the 9900K when both products are overclocked, for example. So it all depends on how the game responds to frequency versus threads, although there does seem to be a mean forming at about 13%. That said, the 3900X does pull ahead in 1% and 0.1% lows. We occasionally have some trouble with stuttering in Assassin's Creed Origins that affects the 0.1% lows, but the 1% lows sample enough frames that it's safe to say the 3900X is ahead in frame pacing here. The stock 3900X also outperforms the stock 3600 by 17.2%, a refreshingly straightforward advantage for the higher end part. Overclocking the 3900X barely improved the average, and it worsened the lows, which is to do with the way the frequency bounces around based on boost as opposed to the all-core overclock when it's locked. This frame time plot will help illustrate what's happening. Remember that these are the raw numbers from which FPS is derived, and so stand as the most accurate representation of real gaming experience and frame-to-frame fluidity. It's just a little harder to compartmentalize, so we don't use it for every game. The 9900K starts with overall frame-to-frame intervals lower than the 3900X, which is a positive thing for the Intel 9900K. Lower is better, but more consistent is best. For reference, 16.667 milliseconds would be 60 FPS. The 9900K encounters the same amount of spikes in testing as the 3900X, as this game has a less flat line than others, but its spikes are more frequently beyond 12 milliseconds. This isn't bad on its own, but an excursion from the mean greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds does start to become noticeable as a stutter. The AMD R9 3900X has higher frame times overall, at roughly 6 to 8 milliseconds versus Intel's 5 to 7 millisecond range average, but its spikes don't hit the same higher peaks that Intel does. So this is why the 3900X does better in frame pacing once we use the average bar chart that we saw earlier. The 1440p results are like the 1080p results but compressed, with the GPU bottleneck now becoming more apparent. Overclocking had no significant effect on either the 9900K or 3900X at this resolution, and the 3900X's lead over the 3600 shrank down to 4.3%. There's a reason we still test CPUs at 1080p even as higher resolutions become popular, but this chart allows us to see that even 1440p does have points where the CPUs start to matter, at least for the high-end GPUs. As an aside, take a look at the R5 3600's SMT off results, or the 3900X's for that matter, to see what happens to frame time performance as AMD's threads are disabled with this game. It actually matters in this one. GTA 5 is next, and is our geriatric game on the benchmark. It's still a top-played game on Steam, though, and its DX11 implementation is a traditional one, so we like to include it. The 9900K leads the 3900X in GTA 5 stock, ranked at 122 FPS average versus the 3900X's 110 FPS average. That's a lead of 11% for the Intel part. Although Intel is still ahead, its lead is shrinking with each generation. Versus the 2700X, the stock CPU, the results of 93.6 FPS average allowed Intel to manage a lead of 31%. So this new climb is significant, and most of it is to do with IPC and frequency, although in some games the thread count actually matters, just not particularly this one. The 9900K improves more with an overclock than the 3900X does, predictably, moving to 131 FPS average versus 113 FPS average of the overclocked 3900X. And that's because the 3900X is already nearing its maximum performance potential without extreme cooling. With the CPUs we've tested so far, GTA doesn't scale up in performance much with thread counts higher than 4, so the 3900X's 5.4% gain in average FPS versus the 3600 is mostly down to higher clocks. The 12-core, 12-thread, 4.4 GHz overclock pushed the average FPS up to 118.5, past 113 for the 4.3 GHz 12-core, 24-thread OC, seemingly completely unaffected by the loss of threads. As discussed in the 3600 review, the GTA results we've gathered so far are almost identical at 1080p and 1440p, thanks to the CPU-heavy settings we use in the game, but we wanted to show this chart anyway just to give you some extra data. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. Using a modified Crystal engine and DirectX 12, the 9900K performs at 170 FPS average when stock, placing it as 18.6% past the 3900X's stock 143 FPS average result, and that's with Intel's CPU becoming GPU limited at the top of the chart. Despite the GPU limit, we have never tested below 1080p in GN's history actually for desktop CPU benchmarks, as we don't believe it to be an accurate representation of real use. I think the last time we used it might have been for a Fraps versus Shadowplay recording comparison, but not for gaming benchmarks. So 1080p is and has been our floor. If it bottlenecks here, we just make a note and move on. Shadow of the Tomb Raider seems to only benefit from SMT up to a point, although enabling SMT doesn't tank the 3900X's performance as it does in some other benchmarks. Overclocking the 3900X only got its average FPS score up 2%, but disabling SMT in combination with a slightly higher overclock raised it by 6.6%. Even at stock, though, the 3900X outperforms any of the 3600's results. Hitman 2 is our last game benchmark. A pattern is emerging with Hitman 2, where the 8-core 16-thread 9900K and 12-core 24-thread 3900X both benefit from disabling multi-threading, while the 6-core 12-thread 3600 part performs better with SMT on, and we can highlight the SMT off result to illustrate that. It's not as simple as just saying more than 12 threads is bad, though, because the 8-core 16-thread 1700 outperforms the 6-core 12-thread 1600 both stock and overclocked. What we can say for now is that Hitman 2 strongly benefits from more threads up to a point and begins to scale negatively past that point, both for AMD and Intel. In any case, the stock 3900X still outperforms any of the 3600's results, and the stock 9900K surpasses the stock 3900X by 12.9%, running at 136 FPS average versus 121 FPS average when both the 9900K and 3900X are stock. Disabling hyperthreading and seeing such uplift illustrates that we are not GPU bottlenecked in this title, so it joins the list of titles usable to illustrate the full range of scaling between the two stock CPUs. Overclocking offers a slight improvement for each, but nothing major for either CPU. We showed power testing in our R5 3600 review, but we'll quickly go over it again here. In a Blender workload at 100% saturation across all threads, the AMD R9 3900X stock CPU ends up measuring at 148 watts down the EPS 12-volt cables, which is far away from the TDP designation of 105 watts. It's not even close. Technically, TDP is not one-to-one with power consumption, but it's close, and being at 148 to 105 is a big difference. We need to investigate these BIOS versions and see what's going on with the different platforms. For what it's worth, the platform does operate within TDP bounds during gaming workloads, but not in all core loads like Blender. We think this may have to do with the stock auto voltages on some early motherboards, but we're not positive just yet. There isn't an MCE equivalent option that we found yet, and PBO is disabled in all of our review content unless otherwise stated because it's not within spec. For Hitman 2, just as a quick measurement, we see power consumption more reasonably situated at 76 watts stock. You'll notice that our overclock here consumes less power than the stock CPU by a few watts, and that's because we were able to tune voltage down below what was auto-selected in this workload. More power and thermal discussion after we survived the launch day. This was already too much to do in the time we had, so we'll table the rest of it for now. There's a lot more testing we still want to do. For example, we still need to dig into the thermals, we need to look into the power some more, we really want to look into streaming some more, for our standalone streaming benchmarks, and a couple of other ideas we have for scaling testing. So it's just, there were so many products at once this time that we decided to review about five of them in the 2 launch day period, and then we'll just circle back for the other stuff later. So hang tight with us for a couple days while we go through all the follow-up testing, but there's a lot more to do yet. So power consumption's our only big remaining question mark at this point, other than some additional testing we want to do elsewhere, and we won't spoil too much of that now. But as stated, it's been like 16 to 20 hours a day for a week, and all of this is the result. Multiple videos, multiple 30-minute long, really detailed testing and reviews. So we're not going to dig into the power anymore right now. We need to, because it seems to be a bit high. And the Intel platform, if you disable MCE, you get it down to almost exactly Intel's defined TDP number. And again, TDP is not 1-to-1, but it's really close, because ultimately it all turns into heat anyway and into power. But yeah, so we need to look into that more. And the power consumption of the chip could relate to auto voltages. They are a bit high. And that does lead into another interesting topic, which is that on the positive side, our R9 3900X seems to be, we're new to this platform, of course, everyone is, but it seems to be a good overclocker. So the voltage was about 1.34 to 1.35 for that one to hold all core at 4.3. We could not get to 4.4 on anything until we disabled SMT on the 3900X, and then we could do 4.4 gigahertz, that is. So 4.3 seems to be about the max for all the processors we've tested so far. Doesn't matter the voltage up until you get to extreme cooling, then it'll matter, of course. And the higher end CPUs have performed better than the low end CPU we tested, the 3600, sample size of 1 of each. So it doesn't really count, but gives you an idea. In theory, the higher end CPUs should be bin better anyway, because they have more things enabled. So that would make sense. Anyway, the 3900X is a powerhouse in applications that are thread and cache bound, and calling it a competitor to the 9900K in these tasks isn't hyperbole on AMD's part. For production workloads, it's often better as a CPU by a considerable margin, sometimes north of 50%, once or twice north of 60%. Much of that is due to the 3900X's 24 threads, though, and AMD has been making Threadripper chips with even higher core counts for some time now, some of which are now on steep sales and dropping below the 9900K in price. The 3900X needs to strike a balance between gaming and production performance to be something new and to compete with the 9900K in a way that Threadripper doesn't already. The results are mixed. The 9900K is just better in non-thread bound applications, and AMD can't force game developers to just flip a switch and make everything thread focused overnight, which is something we've been talking about for a few years now. The 3900X continues the legacy of the previous Ryzen processors, where we can confidently recommend it as a mixed workload CPU, and we can confidently recommend the R5, period. So that's a good place for the R5 to be. But the 3900X, we're more in the range of, it depends. It's not as simple as the R5 is. With the 3900X, we can recommend it in mixed workloads. We can recommend it in sort of budget in quotes, tier production workloads. And that's if you don't want to just buy a used AMD processor from the last couple of generations, because you can get these older-ish processors for significantly discounted. The 2700 is regularly $200 now. Now, the 3900X is much more powerful than that, so it's not as simple as the 2700X versus the 3700X, but it's a consideration if you're on a much stricter budget. And Threadripper, as noted, has also routinely been on sale. First-gen Threadripper does have quite a few deficiencies in some areas that the 3900X solves, but if you only need threads, it's worth considering for a cheaper solution. That's not to take away from the 3900X, though. It does well in these workloads. Gaming. So for gaming workloads, the recommendation, if you're pure gaming, high refresh, don't care about anything else, never work with any other applications, maybe you work with Premiere now and then, it's close enough to the 3900X, although AMD does notably outperform Intel in our tests in Premiere for once at a head-to-head. But if you're mostly gaming and maybe Premiere now and then, or Photoshop, then Intel would get the recommendation still. The 3900X it's not a clean sweep. It's a good processor, but it's not good at everything all the time. And that's fine. It doesn't need to be. So where we would recommend the 3600 almost always at its price category, specifically at about $200, except for against older processors that you can get for cheap. We're only talking modern stuff that's still being made. So where we would recommend that basically everywhere, the 3900X, we reserve recommendations for a mixed workload user who genuinely actually does some production type of task on the side. Maybe you're a hobbyist video editor, maybe you do 3D animation and modeling, and you render with the CPU, things like that. Then, or transcoding, compression, especially decompression, stuff like that. If you do any of that mixed with gaming, it's a good choice. If you only game, it's still going to be the 9900K from us. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Definitely go watch the R5 3600 review. We have the 5700 XT review going up as well, or up already by the time this goes up probably, and a teardown of this coming up shortly. 3700X review is next. Check back. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our toolkits to support us directly, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to donate some sleep. I think that works. I believe there's a sleep bank I can withdraw from. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.